My first immediate memory of this triptych tapestry is the colour. The colour is incredibly vibrant and strong, and some of the mixes were just amazing. You put so much colour into the blends, and yet they still worked. And they were quite unusual combinations: purple and yellow, green and pink and turquoise, and it was just great to weave.
So for me, the memory with this project is the charcoal lines and building up to those lines on the back of what Emma Jo was saying, with all these incredible mixes and colours, and building those colours up to the line, and then working out what colours were on either side of the charcoal and bringing them into the charcoal lines and balancing them, getting all those little flecks, because they weren't just solid black lines. They had sort of flecks of colour coming in and out of them, and where the grains of charcoal had sort of drifted off into the water. I anticipated those. I quite like those.
So one of the things that Chris quite openly discussed was about challenging the weavers and challenging them to weave water and watercolour. And I think he was probably thought it was something new to us, but we actually over the years have woven quite a lot of both tapestries where the subject's water, but also designs that have been designed in watercolour. So neither of those were new challenges to us, but it is always a challenge trying to capture that sort of translucency of watercolour into wool and cotton is quite difficult. And I think the other thing is that by painting with watercolour or paint, you've got a fluidity and a spontaneity, whereas when we're weaving it, we're having to both break it down, but every pass of wool that we're putting in, every bit of wool has to be considered. So you're trying to recreate that spontaneity, but in quite a different medium and with a different approach.
I really enjoyed weaving. There was two parts that I really enjoyed weaving in the tapestry. The first part was in the top of the first panel, where I worked from the purple transcending up into the yellow, and I used a kind of minky brown to help that blend through. And then in the last panel there was the bird in the bird cage, which was quite structured compared to the other parts of the tapestry, and I had to make sure that the colours glowed through the bars of the cage, and I just really enjoyed doing those bits.
And the balance of the whole image, the colour, balance of colour on the whole image is actually quite strange when we broke it down into A3 panels, but also then on the looms you could only see sections of them at a time. And I came into the project when the first panel had been completed and was getting cut off the loom, and then I started weaving on the large middle panel. And it was quite strange because I had seen the first panel and it was so intense, it was so vibrant, the colours were so powerful, and yet the start of the middle panel, when we started weaving, they were like we said, ice cream colours. They were all pastels and pales, and it just didn't, it was quite a strange contrast to the colours that I'd seen coming off the loom on the first panel. And obviously that changed, but it was sort of on the loom we just had this strip that was like an ice cream store. But obviously that moved and changed as we rolled the tapestry down around the loom. And when you sit back and look at it, and there's sort of strange intensities of colour when you start to break it down.
I think one of the things that I'm most impressed by is capturing the light in the piece. So there's the water, and obviously the light's hitting on that water, but then you've got this really quite dark, moody sky. You know, you feel like there's a storm coming, but then you've also got the two panels at each side, and that kind of curtain effect, which is quite dark and cosy, but they're looking into this scene that's just capturing that light and the storm coming, and I think it's quite impressive how that's been caught.
Even the light on the water in the two different panels is quite different.
One of the more challenging things I found was making sure that all three panels lined up, because we wove them separately. So we started on the left hand panel, then we wove the middle panel, then the right hand panel, and they were never on the loom together. So then to make sure that things like the tree trunk and the horizon line actually matched up when the three panels were hung was quite a challenge.
I think it was also quite challenging because you get the sense, well, I think I'd be right in saying that Chris didn't paint the picture, or the picture wasn't painted and then cut into three separate things. So they actually never lined up to start with. So I remember rolling out the panels and sitting and checking the colours on each side so that we knew there was that continuation.
And there was also the gap between each panel, so we had to account for that, especially in that tree trunk. Spending so much time on a project is, I think, quite a special thing to have a project that spans nearly 3 years. And it probably actually was more by the time that we had met Chris, shared with him our process, and then he went away and designed the tapestry. Then there was sampling, so it probably spanned nearly 3 years. I think it means that you can really invest in the project. You really start to live and breathe it. You become really familiar with the palette, so all those things just make it a bit more of a meaningful project for the weavers.
I also really like it when you are working on a big project, that when you come in every day you know where you're sitting and you know what you're doing. I find that very satisfying and quite comforting in a way.
And I like that we always joke that you end up wearing the colours. So when you're working on something for so long, you start changing your wardrobe to a greater or lesser extent that blends in with the colours you're working with.
Before we start weaving, we do a lot of sampling. We start to work out the sort of basic colour palette, and that informs whether we have the right colours in the studio or we need to order things. We work out materials, so in the water we have added in a cotton just to almost make the surface glisten. So there's a mixture of cottons and wools in this project. We also work out the language in the sampling so that all the weavers are coming from the same approach, we're weaving the same thing, and we're almost working out the artist's handwriting in those samples as well. And then we'll share that with the artist, so we shared that with Chris so that he felt that it was working and it was reflecting what he had designed. And that really means that before we have started weaving on the actual tapestry, we've got a lot of those things worked out. We will then continue to adapt depending on how that comes up in the tapestry, but a lot of it's worked out before we start weaving. So we were looking at different parts of mark making, different colour palettes, lines, watercolour. So we tried to cover a lot of different areas in the sampling just to try and resolve a lot of different elements of the tapestry.
I always think with the sampling, for me personally, a lot of what I'm trying is sort of eliminating things to find the right thing. So I'm selecting certain areas of an image to try and figure out how to translate that and eliminate what doesn't work more than what does work.
Who's got highlights?
Seeing it finished. Seeing, actually, maybe one of the biggest highlights was getting all 3 panels in their rough state, sort of just off the loom, together on the studio floor, and just seeing 3 finished. They weren't hemmed, they hadn't been finished, but the completed weaving just sat all 3 of them together on the studio floor. That was probably a highlight.
That's right, because we cut them off separately. You know, we because we wove each panel separately, so it wasn't until the 3rd one was cut off that we could bring it together
Actually
as a triptych. Yeah.
To see all 3 together, yeah, because we wove one, then rolled it up and put it away, wove the next one. So that's probably, maybe that tops seeing it in the National Gallery.
I think one of my highlights was installing it with Chris at the National Gallery and seeing it with the back painted walls that had been done for that install. It was just to see his vision of how the tapestry would be displayed, and then obviously going and hanging it in the Clothworkers Hall and its new home was also a highlight. And
Quite a different setting as well.
yes.
I think it's remarkable, and every time you look at it and every time hearing you speak about it, I get quite emotional. It's really special. It's a really remarkable piece, and it's, for me, in everything that you say about how all of this comes together and as a team. You know, it's not the work of one hand, it's the work of many, and I find that kind of fascinating. I don't know if you want to say any more about that, but for me I think that's a really remarkable thing about the weaving process, is it's never normally just the one hand, it is this combination, and I'm always, well, when I look at this I'm always kind of so in awe that you create something which looks so continuous, if you see what I mean, and where everything falls together, but it's done in that way that you're all working in a kind of in a concert or something.
We've always got to keep the bigger picture, the whole tapestry in our head while we're weaving it, but the way that we deal with it is almost to break it down, so you're looking at just the smaller bit, the bit you're in, while keeping that bigger picture, because you would become overwhelmed. You couldn't pick all the colours in a tapestry like that. You can sort of pick the basic ones and then you adapt as you go, but the only way really for a weaver to deal with it is to start breaking it down into sections and smaller bites.
I think as well, sometimes when you break it down into the little sections, and there might be elements within that section that can worry you or that you can find harder, and you might stress about those, and then you look back at the completed piece and you don't even remember which bit it was that you might some bits, but you know, there might be something that you feel isn't quite sitting right, but you look back at it as a completed piece and there's no recollection of which that bit was.
Once it's finished, I often feel quite distant from it, and when you see it again, sometimes it's like, gosh, I can't believe we wove that.
You can feel quite detached, can't you?
Yeah.
I think while you're weaving, you kind of live and breathe it, and you get too close to it because you're creating it, and then it's hard. I think it's like any artist that you can't stand back and be critical of it. So it's really nice to get that break, and then, you know, that's why we're so excited that it's back at Dovecot, because we can see it in a new environment. So I think that's also quite interesting to get a different level of perspective with it. Changes it as well. You almost feel like you're going to be, you could step into it the way that it's displayed at Dovecot.
And the big gap since we last saw it.
I can't wait to see it.
That's a good 6 years, 7 years since I've actually seen it.
I think as a studio weaver, your skill is to be able to weave alongside other weavers, and for it all to, the handwriting to be the same, so you're not doing your own thing, you're collaborating and you're weaving to the same tension. You've worked out the language and the approach for it, so we can pick up each other's work and we can move around on the tapestry, and you shouldn't be able to see. We probably know which bits we've woven, but the viewer shouldn't be able to tell whose hand it is in it, and that's the skill of being a studio weaver.
Though it is great when you get put on parts that you really love doing. Like for me, intense colour is my love tapestry, and that's when this piece was incredibly enjoyable and satisfying for me.
There's some really satisfying colour transitions in it. They aren't necessarily colours that I would normally be drawn to, but I find that there's lots of satisfying, and there's a richness in a lot of it, but there's some quite unusual colour combinations too, which just challenges us all a bit, because they're not the most obvious colour transitions.
There's a lot of little gems in there.
In the third panel, there's some really beautiful little feather marks in the background, which actually can't really be seen from a distance, but when you look up closely, and they were quite tricky to do, because when you first look at it, in a way you thought, oh, there's a nice big bit of weaving, but there isn't. There's these little lines in there that you had to weave, and they're great. They're really great.
I remember discussing them and sort of what level of intensity we gave those marks, because we were translating them from the watercolour, and I'm not sure that maybe in the tapestry they were a bit stronger than they maybe were in the watercolour, but I do remember having conversations about those little feather marks.
I think that's one of the interesting things about translating design into tapestry, is that the weavers are presented with the design, but also a lot of that are incidental marks that have happened that then the artist hasn't necessarily consciously put in, but are very much part of the design. And as the weaver, we have to work out which ones to leave in, which ones to remove, and which ones maybe to make more of. So things that happen spontaneously or incidentally, we have to make a conscious decision about, and I think that's quite an interesting concept for an artist to reflect on as well.